Hello, everybody. My name is Tratnos, and we are still in the Wowhead interview with Morgan Day and Ian Hazakostas. If you missed parts 1 and 2 about Mythic Plus and Raid, respectively, I'll put links in the description, and I'll have one of them show up in the top right. I'll put the Raid ones. The Raid one will have showed up in the top right. You can go click on that, and then in that one, it pops up the Mythic Plus one in the top right, and so you can go a couple of videos deep if you want to catch all the questions. But we're going to go a little bit quicker through the remaining questions in this, starting off with classes in combat. With the removal of increased melee range in War Within, are there any plans to change how bosses can parry melee abilities, especially with the increase of the number of raid bosses that have mechanics that require melee to DPS from the front? Morgan Day said, no, that's something we evaluate on a case-by-case basis. There's always those big raid bosses that are standing on the side of a ledge, and in cases like that, we can very easily disable parry when it makes sense in that case. Ultimately, what is your positioning is something we feel is an important part of core WoW combat, and if there are cases where it does feel unfair for the player because they're dodging mechanics, or because the boss is rooted or something like that, then we can always reevaluate that. But we're not looking to change the core fundamentals of how creatures in WoW work. Yeah, getting parried is very frustrating, especially like on pull often, like on Smolderon on pull, for instance, right? Like, avoiding getting parried can be pretty tough if you're in that spot because the boss, like, you're standing where the boss is getting pulled. I guess you could, sneak around and run at the boss from the other side, but, maybe your tank is going to quickly spin it around and now it's facing at you. And I don't know. I feel like if bosses in WoW just had like a 10-second grace period on pull during which they didn't parry, that would remove much of the worst cases of this. Raid buffs incentivize class diversity and the feeling of being more powerful when you're in a group. We've seen more classes get raid buffs in Dragonflight, with Paladin getting a second and Hunter's Mark, leaving just DK and Shaman. Is there a reason that these classes don't bring any specific buff to the raid? Ian says, ultimately, our goal is broad spec representation and class representation across the different roles. I think we're hesitant to add still more raid buffs that might risk feeling redundant and yet another thing to manage, or that might too heavily force less choice in composition forming. Ideally, though, if you're a pug leader, if you're putting a raid or mythic group, you should want one of every class, and then once you have that covered, you should look at who's available and how you want to fill out the rest of your roster based on your people and the content you're facing. We need to look at diversity, and we want to make sure that classes like Shaman and Death Knight are bringing tools to the raid that make them valued members of a raid group or valued in dungeon groups. That's not to completely close the door on a new raid buff ever coming to them, but our hope continues to be to use the other knobs that the team has at its disposal to get them to a place where they feel equally valuable without just needing a raid buff. Yeah, it's tough, because like Shaman, you do see Shamans in top groups because the enhancement Shamans, it's not really a raid buff, but like the party buff value, the first value of the first Wind Fury totem in most compositions is enough to make them a top DPS choice. But yeah, Shamans, especially Elemental and Resto, Death Knights, Evokers as well. Like Evoker raid buff is actually pretty marginal. Like you're really not bringing Evokers for Blessing the Bronze almost ever. If you had to do without Blessing the Bronze, you could. Evokers do have Time Spiral and now Spatial, but that's a choice node and but that is something that you're sometimes looking to bring them for, but that sort of falls into the same space as like AMZ, which is getting buffed in War Within. It's tough because like, the sorts of utility that aren't raid buffs, right? Stuff like AMZ, the first AMZ is a lot better than the second AMZ, but it's not as much better than the first Chaos Brand is compared to the second Chaos Brand, right? The second Chaos Brand does absolutely nothing. The first does a lot. Whereas for DK is like, if the first AMZ is good on a fight, the second AMZ is usually also good. Sometimes you use it on the same mechanic and you just let one of them get eaten through, but often you just have multiple spots in the fight where it's like, oh cool, we throw an AMZ on this, right? Like that's good. That's nice. So using knobs like that to try and make these specs good, it's tough because it's pretty hard to land in a spot where you're going to accomplish that I want one DK to fill out my raid group to feel like I have the cool DK utility. Because if you make that utility good, it's duplicable, right? In a way that Chaos Brand, Battle Shout aren't. And so if one DK is good, the odds are pretty good that multiple are good. And so then you maybe move these classes to a spot where you kind of want 0 or 4 of them. And that is, I think, tough. So I do think that they should give these two classes a raid buff. If they, like, I think that would be better. I think it would be better than, it's better for 13 out of 13 classes to have a raid buff than it is for 11 out of 13 classes to have a raid buff. I do think that's true. Class balance is an important aspect of the game to many players. What do you look for when deciding how to balance and when? Morgan Day says, we touched on this briefly as we were discussing raids and raid adjustments coming. We actually try to create a pretty consistent cadence for when our combat team looks at class balance and setting hotfixes as the season progresses, and we'll continue that philosophy going into War Within. We feel this was very effective in Dragonflight. In terms of what we do look for, we often talk about, not too dissimilar from what Ian was just talking about, different strengths and weaknesses for classes. We'll often ask the question, if we can wave a magic wand, what should this look like? Whether we're looking at a specific raid encounter, what should the damage meter look like? What should the healing meter look like? Who should be winning this, and are they? We'll often come up with these high-level philosophies that really guide our tuning in terms of where should this class be? Is this their strength? Should they be winning here? And letting that direct what kind of adjustments we make. So this sort of makes sense. Like, there are fights like, for example, Council of Dreams, where if you look at a fight like Council of Dreams and like, if Ellie Shamans, Affliction Warlocks, Shadow Priest, Balance Druids aren't looking good on a fight like Council of Dreams, what are we doing here, right? Like that sort of fight should cater to the design of those specs. Yeah, that does make sense. The fact that they're very effective in Dragonflight, I mean, there was a good pace of buffs and nerfs, especially early in Dragonflight. I don't know, going into Season 4, especially for Mythic Plus, it's tough because, technically, they did buff a bunch of underperforming specs and nerf a bunch of not nerf a bunch of overperforming ones, but Avengers Demon Hunter did receive a nerf. Resto Druid did receive a nerf. Mistweaver received a nerf coming into the season. Mistweaver, the biggest one of those by quite a bit. So they did do some stuff coming into Season 4 to do some of that buffing and nerfing, but it does feel like Season 4 has been left in a especially griefed metagame. But, you look at Season 2, right? Like, Season 2, God Comp came out, and they nerfed every spec in God Comp at least 3 times before they could, over the course of that season, and it was still the best comp at the end of the season. So I think in a lot of cases, it's there's people will read this and get mad, but it is true that Blizzard are often doing buffs and nerfs, and people kind of forget about them because, if they buff a best spec and it stays the best spec, people kind of pretend like it didn't happen. But I think what's important is that they do enough buffs and nerfs that you can play the stuff that isn't the best stuff and not feel like you're weighing your group down and also feel like you can't get invites to stuff. And I don't think they hit that mark all throughout Dragonflight, particularly in Seasons 2 and 4. I think that was something that they missed, but, I do think that they are correct that they did do a good job of having there were previous seasons in WoW's history in previous expansions where you could go months without any crickets chirping from class balance, and this was early in expansions as well. And Dragonflight definitely felt like they were at the wheel a lot of these seasons. Just they did drive into a couple of the sand barriers on the side of the road in Seasons 2 and 4, but these things happen. Hero talents are one of the premier features of War Within, and some of the specs having fairly stunning visuals attached to these new spells and abilities, while others it's a bit more subdued. Will we see additional visuals coming to those specs with fewer new animations? Could we see more hero spec integration in visuals and cosmetics, something like tier sets or hero spec weapon transmogs? Morgan Day said, that's a super interesting idea. I'll talk about the first part. Hero talents are an evergreen addition to World of Warcraft. The same way we might revisit some existing class spells to bring them up to modern standards, we totally plan to revisit hero talents and add some additional polish in future War Within patches, so that's definitely something that's on the table. I see this as sort of similar to Covenant abilities, right? Where it's the Covenant abilities that launched at the start of Shadowlands, most received a little bit of tuning over the course of that expansion, and I think if they'd continued into a future expansion, we would have likely seen a big tuning pass going into the next expansion on them. And there were a few that got reworked, like Conqueror's Banner for Warrior, for instance. They basically threw out the first design, brought in a new one, and I expect that sort of thing will happen with hero talents as well, where I wouldn't be surprised if in patch 11.2 there was a hero talent tree that just got overhauled because it's okay, this clearly isn't working. And it's going to be pack leader as well. You can write that one down, cash that, take that to the bank and cash it. We actually want to be really careful. One of our anti-goals, as it were, early on was to not create a multiplicative number of specs. We didn't want to end up with 108 specs in the game. So we want to be careful not to do too much there that will make it feel like I'm a Herald of the Light Paladin, I'm not a Rep Paladin. It's something we want to be really careful to avoid, so while adding awesome new visuals is something that's in the cards, how we leverage that new fantasy is something that's really deliberate and careful as we move forward. Makes sense. We saw some late expansion changes to healers in Dragonflight, and healing has been mentioned as being a problem. What is the design goal of healers in War Within to further address these changes or these issues, and or to make healing a more fun role in WoW? Ian says, healing continues to be a major topic among the combat team and the encounter team. Those are the two sides of the coin here. We've taken the opportunity to do something we weren't able to do mid-expansion during Dragonflight and rebalance the overall size of health pools that players have relative to incoming damage, their healing tools, their personal percentage-based heals, and so forth in a way that is effectively nerfing healing. And I felt this on beta as well. It's funny because they did also do this in the middle of Dragonflight, like twice. It's always one of those paradoxes of this debate that nerfing healing sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like a thing that should make healers unhappy. But reducing the relative power of healing in this case, as players have done a great job of highlighting, has improved healer gameplay overall because it slows down the pace at which healers are emptying and refilling health bars and allows for more triage and decision making about where your healing is going, as opposed to a world where players can top others off with a single GCD or two. Then the only way to threaten players' lives is by damaging them even faster than that, or creating situations where healers have to react, or players have to preemptively use defensive cooldowns in order to survive. And this is 100% accurate. That's something we're keeping a very close eye on over the course of raid and dungeon testing on beta. We're also looking at players' self-healing and its proliferation across specs and roles. I think the team is in the process of looking at the leech stat and making adjustments to the throughput it delivers, because that's often just the passive self-healing that people are bringing to an encounter that makes encounter designers have to add unavoidable pulsing damage to offset it. At which point, let's just take a step back and mutually disarm here and let healers be again in the spotlight. And I agree with this. I think this is good. I think healers, should... First of all, healing rot damage can be fun, but it's hard to heal rot damage and have that rot damage feel fair in a world where a bunch of specs are just able to ignore it, like Havoc Demon Hunters and Warlocks, for instance, right? Those specs, they don't need any healing against the rot damage, right? They're just topping themselves. That is, I think, a very fair thing. Like, a little bit of defensiveness, a little bit of self-healing, being a little bit tankier against that kind of damage than other specs, I think is a fair niche for those specs. But it shouldn't be so overwhelming that you don't need to heal those players. People often talk about this as sort of a trade-off, right, between healer agency and the agency of other players, right? And it's like, if I'm a good DPS player, should I need a healer to heal me to live a fight? I think the answer there should be yes. If I'm a good tank player, should I need healers to survive a fight? I think the answer there should be like, you should be able to live for quite a long time without a healer. Like, if you're a good tank player and you're playing the fight well, like, you playing the fight well should adjust you along the continuum of, like, I need a little bit of healer help every, minute or so, to I need kind of constant healer attention, right? Like, that should be the difference between a good tank and a bad tank. I don't think it should be the case where it's like, I need healer attention every 3 globals versus I need healer attention every 2 globals. Like, I think that being the difference between a good and bad tank feels really bad for the tank side of things. But for DPS players, like, I think that, healers should be involved in keeping those players alive, and it shouldn't just be a case of healers only save you if you take avoidable damage. Like, I think that should be unavoidable as well. It's really fascinating for the team looking at Classic, as Classic continues to play out in different forms, in different expansions, to see a direct contrast, a point of comparison, the pace of healing and how healing played out in different eras of the GAM. At times, it can be easy with a series of incremental changes to arrive at a place that's meaningful different than where you started, and not necessarily one that you intended to arrive at, but being able to look back in time and how different systems and sets of tuning values interacted can help inform the discussion on how healing should feel today. At the end of the day, we want healers to be responsible for the health and well-being of their parties, assuming the tank is keeping things under control, but not overly stressed in doing so. They should feel powerful in their ability to save and correct mistakes that their group has made, but also that they're not spinning so many plates at a given time that if they make a single mistake or take a breath for a single second, something is going to collapse. That's the space we're continuing to navigate. Testing continues, but healing stats and breakdowns are something the team is looking at every day. Love it. I'm glad they're looking at this. I do think this is a good diagnosis of problems. I think that it is largely fruitless to try and solve this in a world where a lot of specs have 5 defensive buttons they can press. I think that as long as that remains true, it is going to be very, very difficult to, as they say, challenge players in a way that doesn't involve just one-shotting them, right? Preemptively using defensive cooldowns in order to survive. I think it's just very hard to do that in a world where players have enough defensives that they can press one for every incoming damage, every big incoming damage event. But I hope I'm wrong about that, or I hope that they change the defensives thing. But spoiler alert, I saw an answer already from this where they said they weren't going to do that, so that might be this next one even here. Yeah, okay. Many content creators have been talking about a defensive creep in the game, and many hero talents added more defensive power to classes. The delta between players who do use defenses effectively and players who don't seems to have gotten very large, leading to a very large delta in damage taken and survivability, sometimes even removing the need for healers altogether. Do you feel like defensive creep is real, and are there any plans to do anything about it before the launch of the expansion? Ian says, it is definitely real in some forms. I think objectively, Dragonflight in the talent system added the ability to opt into more hybrid utility, more defensive and self-healing tools for DPS specs that may be part of hybrid classes in particular. On the one hand, I think there's some cool fantasy there, and underscoring the utility options that are available to a class, and the fact that the solution to every problem shouldn't always be damage, even if you're a damage dealer. There's a lot of value in world content and in smaller group content, certainly Delves and War Within, to having those tools and really being able to manage your own survival better. At the same time, I think we're also keenly aware of the pressure that places on encounter design and on healing at the very high end, where we need to assume players are making use of all the tools available to them, and there's a point where if having a defensive means that all the encounter designers have to hit you harder to assume you're using the defensive, having a defensive isn't necessarily making your life easier or better as a player. In some ways, it becomes a little bit of a tax. So I think we're not in a position where we're going to go through and rip out a whole bunch of abilities for War Within in the coming weeks. But I think we are looking at what an ongoing disarmament there might look like. I think it's important that all players have some outs to situations, tools they can use, but they shouldn't have so many that we're assuming that one is always up, and they shouldn't be so potent or so frequently available that they're overshadowing the contributions of a healer to keeping you all alive in a group setting. Yeah, so, I mean, this is acknowledging, I think, parts of the problem. It's also definitely true that in a lot of ways it is a very high-end problem, too, where, there's a lot of content where... It's because, see, this is the thing about defensives, right? Like, it feels good when you are doing a key and something goes wrong or a cast is going through on you, and so you can look at your defenses available or something, or know which ones are going to be up, and then press one of them and be like, cool, right? Like, Fireball got cast on me. That was going to be bad. I was half health. I pressed a defensive. Like, I made a good play against that, right? Having defensives occupy that space is really satisfying. That's one of the best parts of playing WoW, right? Is like using your defensives to defend yourself. But the problem is that when the defensives do become part of the cookbook, right? Part of the recipe that you're using to defeat a encounter or trash, now you don't actually get to do that anymore, right? Like, I'm sure you've had this experience where you're looking at it and you're like, man, this fireball's getting cast on me. Like, I can see it coming. I can't press I can't press Ice Block here because I need Ice Block for this ability at this time or whatever, right? Like, or it's on CD because I used this ability at this time. And here's what I'll say for players in that spot. First of all, just press your defensive if you need it to live and then call for an external later. Usually there's one available. So that is a little bit of a skill expression that you can do in those spots where something goes wrong, figure it out, survive first, figure out how you're going to survive the later mechanics later. That is something that definitely still can happen. But realistically, that's something that you can do in a couple of spots. Usually it is the case where you're just kind of like, yeah, my defensives are spoken for now, right? I'm not using my defensives reactively, which I think is how defensives should generally be used, but instead I'm using them proactively. And I think the only cases where proactive defensives should be used are in cases like Xavius in Darkheart Thicket, when he reaches 50% health and he's like, you guys have done it now, I'm getting really mad, and he starts casting, and then he goes boom, and the room explodes and stuff is falling from the ceiling, right? That's a case where if you're like, oh, at 50% health, Xavius gets pretty mad, I'm going to have a defensive ready for that. Like, doing that once per encounter, I think is cool. I think that's a fine place to require people to use defensives. On the other hand, if it's like, hey, I'm Jimmy McThird boss of whatever War Within dungeon, and I do a stomp every 25 seconds, and you need to have at least a 20% DR to live this stomp and a plus 10 key. No. That's not good. That's a very bad way for this to work. So that's my take on this. Morgan Day said another area we're looking at here, where I actually think there's a bit of an outsized impact, is actually augmentation in M+ in particular. We look at a lot of their representation in raids and their damage contributions, and it's significant, but it doesn't feel outsized compared to the survivability benefits that they bring. This is true, except for the top 20 guilds in the world. I don't know. It's a little bit murky, but somewhere around there is the place where the Aug Evokers are providing the most defense and also the most damage by quite a lot. But yeah, this is generally true across raid. But yeah, an M+ Aug is a menace. You know, you're bringing Zephyr rescue shields, black attunement, empowered black attunement, off healing that costs very little throughput, verse buffs from shifting sands, right? What is it? Not obsidian scales, that's the black attunement enhancing thing, but blistering scales, right? You're providing so much survivability benefits, yeah. Especially in smaller group sizes, it's really significant to the point where it might take something that could otherwise be unmanageable by a group. Even a group that's using their defensives really effectively couldn't do that. But with the extra bump from an Aug, maybe they can. So that's another area where the team has been looking pretty closely at that, and that's a space where we'll look to maybe make some adjustments also before launch of War Within. Yeah, I think taking another look at augmentation is definitely something I would recommend. For Blizzard is in M+ and Raid. I do still think Raid as well. I think they should just make it buff the party instead of your prescience targets. I do think, like, this would require some restructuring of how Aug would work, but I do think that would really help them avoid having to nerf Aug, because Aug is in this place right now where it already feels like kind of icky to play it in a low coordination group, right? Like you're playing Aug, you're like, is this even good, right? Like in you know your 14 player normal raid that plays for 2.5 hours every third Sunday of the month or something. Like that group is not getting much value out of an Aug Evoker. And Aug has had to take a lot of nerfs to how much, stat they're providing to people because of the way that a really good Aug can weave those buffs to be on the perfect players at the perfect times. But that process of actually landing the buffs on the perfect players at the perfect times isn't really a fun one because it involves Microsoft Excel, and it doesn't involve all that much like, oh, cool, I'm a good player in the middle of a fight, noticing that now is probably about to be the time that the mage is going to combust because I've got my sixth sense and I'm mentally connected to the mage, and yeah, I can tell it's going to be combusting time soon. Let me throw prescience on him. Like that's not really an experience that happens. So I think that they should rethink that. And also its survivability impact on M+, 100%. Black attunement should be like, it should be nothing most of the time, and then 4% when you press obsidian scales, that kind of thing. A mid-expansion release of a new spec was certainly a first for WoW with the introduction of Aug Evoker. How successful was the addition of augmentation into the WoW landscape? Ian says, I think overall we remain happy with the experiment of trying to reintroduce a very support-style damage dealer in the vein of what Shadow or Enhance or Ret were 15 plus years ago, where a huge portion of your contribution was amping the capabilities of the people around you, as opposed to doing the damage directly yourself. I think it's no secret, and we've said it on multiple occasions, obviously, we came out a bit more than a bit too strong in terms of overall tuning. We have, I think, reined in augmentation a couple times. Our goal is for them to see representation comparable to other damage dealers. We're keeping an eye on augmentation representation in dungeon groups, as Morgan alluded to, and the defensive tools that they bring. If you get to a point to the very, very high end of keys where they're making the difference between just binary pass-fail check of you can do it versus you'll die if you don't have the Aug, that's not ideal and that's a problem, but broadly speaking, it's a fun playstyle that a lot of people have embraced, and I think we want to make sure we continue to preserve that while not having too rigid of a comp situation like dungeons in particular. And I think this point is well taken. Like I 100% respect that Aug's dominance in keys in its current state is a high-end problem. In a lot of cases, Aug kind of stinky. You're doing a weekly +6 key or something like that, and you got 2 evokers sign up for your group, and one's an Aug and one's a dev. I don't know about you, but I'm picking the dev every time, right? That I think is very true. So I do think they should be looking at ways with Aug to actually simultaneously raise the floor while lowering the ceiling of the spec. And yeah, defensive value being brought to the group, I think, is a good way of doing that. In addition, I think they need to do that with throughput as well. But it is, I'm not an Aug hater. I think that Aug is a cool playstyle that's been brought to the game. And honestly, like, I wouldn't be surprised if there are enough people that would enjoy that type of playstyle that they should maybe look at making more support specs. But I do think before I would be comfortable with that, I think they need to show that they can get a handle on the balancing it so that it's simultaneously good but not OP in high-end content, good but not OP in middle-end content, and good but not OP in low-end content. That is a very hard thing to do with this spec in particular. They've made some really big steps toward it as a thing. Like they've had some insights and made some changes to the spec that I wasn't expecting, like over the course of the nerfs to it, that have accomplished that, I think, in a lot of cases. So they've moved closer towards what I think AUG should be from where it started. And I think if they get all the way there, then we're gonna have no problem at all. But I do think it's not quite there yet. How do you feel the reduced range for Evoker has played out in practice? Morgan says, yeah, this is something that comes up on occasion. I know the team recently was discussing this as it was a hot button topic, and ultimately, this gets back to what we were discussing about creating unique strengths and weaknesses, especially as we continue to expand. New classes in World of Warcraft, sometimes you just have to carve out new design space in areas we can find fun gameplay for a spec or class, and ultimately, we're pretty happy with where that's landed. I always like to point out to the team that if the reduced range feels like a significant detriment to the class, then let's make sure the strengths counterbalance that. Let's make sure that when there is an area where we're a little bit clumped up or the fight space is a little bit more close quarters, that they really shine in those circumstances. And then also making sure that as we add hero talents, as we expand other classes' utility, that Evokers continue to feel they are a highly mobile class and they're not falling behind in that aspect either. So it's definitely something that we think has created some fun gameplay and some really unique design spaces for the team to chase, and we continue to want to pursue that. I think this is like the range problem for Evoker. It does feel bad in some times, in some fights. It hasn't been cataclysmic. I hesitate to sound like those people that are just like, bro, just add one more lane to the freeway. It's going to fix the traffic problems. But like, bro, just add 5 more yards. 5 more yards to Pres Evoker, bring him up to 35. 5 more yards to Dev and Aug, bring him up to 30. And I think we're chilling. I think that the Evoker range would still be a weakness, but it would stop feeling as bad as it does in some spots. So I could be wrong. It could just be a thing where it's like, okay, now I'm going to want the next 5 yards. But that's my guess. Some specs seem to still be reeling from the AoE cap tuning in BFA, especially on large pulls. Are there any plans to look at AoE caps of all the specs again? Ian says, no current plans overall. We're continuing to tune specs against each other to the representation against each other. Understand that in dungeons in particular at the high end, as pull sizes trend towards the upper end of that spectrum, that can cause balance issues. If loosening or recalculating how AoE caps work for specific specs ends up being the right way to address some of those imbalances, that's a decision the team is going to make. But I think from a philosophical top-down perspective, the way we're looking at it from our positions, we're not looking to overhaul the way that works across all of WoW. It's more of a surgical spec-by-spec basis, ensuring there are different damage profiles from single target to cleave to sustain, to burst AoE to sustained AoE. The different specs have strengths and weaknesses, and that no one is so far outshining the others that it feels like it's the only solution to a given problem players may face. And I was one of the biggest anti-AoE cap people when they first implemented the Shadowlands AoE capping. But I do think that it has mostly become fine now. You know, there are a few specs where you're like, oh man, that's kind of icky. But for the most part, it's like either I'm soft capped at 5 or hard capped at 8 on a couple of specs. And that does come up in some dungeons on some pulls. You know, you're doing the first pull on the right on Algathar Academy and you're an outlaw rogue, you know. It's not going to feel good. It's not going to feel good it doesn't feel good to fight 40 mobs there and only be able to hit 8 of them. But on the other hand, that's one pull in one dungeon. For the most part, in most pulls in most dungeons, you are at or close to your cap, and it's fine. Overall, it does work out okay. And then the specs that are uncapped, they get to pop off on the Algathar right pull. And to some extent, that pull, like the specs that can pop off there, knowing that outlaw rogues exist and can't do that makes it feel better when you're on one of the specs that can do that to a little bit of an extent, right? So as long as that's not something that is happening on multiple pulls per dungeon across multiple dungeons, I think it's not the end of the world. But what is important is that they definitely make sure that, you know, if my spec is uncapped and your spec is capped, you should at least be competing. Like, you should be as good or better than me for sure when we are under the cap. Like that, whenever there's specs that are AoE capped and their cleave sucks, right? There have been specs like that throughout Dragonflight, and that I don't think is inherently an AoE cap problem. because those specs, if you just remove the AoE cap, they would still suck at AoE, right? If it's like, hey, I'm doing 30k damage to each mob, and you're doing 60k damage to each mob, and I'm capped at 8, and you're uncapped, like, yeah, okay, to some extent the cap is adding insult to injury, but the cap is not the injury. The injury is that I'm doing 30k damage to each mob, and if you made my abilities hit all the targets, they're still hitting like a wet noodle. So that, I think, is it is a, like, it's an ability, it's a problem that can be solved without necessarily needing to get rid of the AoE caps. I think that where they've taken the AoE caps is largely healthy now, certain outliers aside. All right, visual clarity. Regarding visual clarity, are there any plans to create an improved swirly graphic that signifies get out, but has a clear border that doesn't expand with the size of the swirly? Morgan Day said, yeah, absolutely. We're always looking to improve visual clarity there, and we're actually cooking up some stuff for War Within that might not necessarily be in for the initial launch, but we are looking to make improvements over time with that. I alluded to this earlier, but those visuals used to be a bit more rare than they are now, so as we use them more frequently, we kind of want to view not only how the player experiences them, but also how we build them ourselves. Fun inside baseball talk from a tech perspective, we build all that by hand, right? Like the individual designer who says, I want this damage to be this size, has to by hand kind of match the visual, and sometimes we call it getting taken to a design court where I get hit when I wasn't supposed to. Ultimately, that's something like that should just be more kind of programmatically solved and will create a more consistent experience for the player as well, and that's areas we're looking to improve also. Very true. I mean, it's absolutely true that there should be something for the encounter designers where they can just plug in, like, yeah, the range of this is 5, and then the hitbox and the graphic will both match up with that, and because it does happen, right? Like you know that call, like, look at my body, I wasn't in that, right? And like some mechanics, you kind of learn, like, oh, the hitbox is generous on this mechanic, oh, the hitbox is harsh on this mechanic. That I think being made more consistent would be good. I think they also, in Tomb of Sargeras, they sort of added this visual that signified, hey, I'm a soak, right? Like, it's a circle. When nobody's standing in it, it does a little fire thing on it. When somebody's standing in it, the fire thing goes away. I think they could add a couple more things like that where we get sort of a unified visual language where we learn, like, hey, this is a swirly that we always want to step out of, versus like, hey, this is a swirly that we usually want to dodge but has some sort of mechanical significance that I need to sometimes pay attention to or whatever. Like, those kind of things could have different unified, consistent visual themes that still get to change colors and stuff and themes based on the mechanical identity of that fight. All right, visual distinctions between friendly AoE and boss abilities seem to overlap often. Is there a way you're planning to make them more distinctive? Ian said, yeah, I think taking a pass on visual language is something we talk about a lot, and an active, ongoing effort on the part of the team. A lot of those changes, unfortunately, that we're working on likely aren't going to be seen right at the start of War Within, other than specific one-off raid mechanics that we're designing to be as readable as possible. But the broader solution to how does this look like something you're supposed to soak? How does it look like something you're supposed to get out of? How is this friendly versus hostile? We have some subtle cues there, and players who've raided in recent years probably recognize, the vertical element to the soak mechanic that goes away once you're standing in it. I was just talking about this. I hadn't read this answer yet. And when you see that little vertical fiery wisp across the raid, you're yelling at someone to go cover it, but that's not necessarily as intuitive as we want it to be. It's not as obvious as we want it to be. So I think there's a lot more we can do there. We've at times been perhaps too conservative, too cautious when it comes to we have a focus on preserving the fantasy of player abilities or enemy abilities. But at the end of the day, just because you're fighting a Fire Lord on a floor that looks like fire and all the things you need to get out of also looks like fire, that is thematically accurate and is in keeping with the fantasy, but it is poor gameplay. And so we know we need to get better there, and that's something that's a focus going forward. Love it. Yeah, Smolderon. See, the thing is, like, you can add lore elements to these fights to let you get more colors in there. Like, the orbs that you're supposed to soak on Smolderon, rather than all the fire you're supposed to dodge, could very easily have been corrupted by Fire Axe Shadow Flame, right? And like, oh, the Shadow Flame orbs that I need to soak, and they're purple instead of red, right? And like, okay, I can see that now. So you don't have to sacrifice the story. We don't need to move to a world of like every single boss fight has the same entire color spectrum of different primary colors that all contrast with each other so that we can see the difference. Like, you can still have them be themed and stuff. It's just like, yeah, we need to have not just red on red and red on red on some fights. Morgan Day said, and finding a way to thread the needle on our side, like the Fire Lord, but what if it's an ice monster? That's going to be blue visuals, probably. And we've been working really hard collaborating amongst our different art partner teams to make sure that if I do know this is an ice monster, can we also make sure the floor isn't the exact same color as the VFX? And we really do want to avoid the situation where everything has those big red, almost UI, very gamey aesthetics that are overlaid on top of our ice visuals. We feel like we can try and find solutions to those problems using more in-game fantasy-forward cells. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, there's a lot of room between where we're at now and it looking against the fantasy, and they can make it a lot more visually clear without having to sacrifice the fantasy, right? We could get a lot clearer without having to sacrifice the fantasy, and then once we get to a point where we've done all we can without sacrificing any fantasy, we probably don't need to make any more improvements. It'll probably be good enough that we don't need to then make the trade-offs where we are giving up fantasy to get more visual clutter. Although I personally would always prefer to get whenever we do reach a point where you're trading off, right? There's something in game theory called, I think, the Pareto curve or whatever, which represents just a continuum of optimal choices you could make, right, between two variables. And it's like, do we go 100% of one? Do we go 100% of the other? Or do we do something in the middle, right? Do we do something in the middle? And as long as we're somewhere on that curve, right, it's fine. Where we are right now, we're missing out on some value because we aren't optimizing, right? Like, we could get more visual clarity without giving up fantasy. And I think that if we kept the same level of fantasy we currently have and just increase the visual clarity to the maximum that we could get without then having to sacrifice and move along that curve, any of the fantasy, I think it would be fine. I think it would be more than enough clarity. Are there any plans to add visual filters allowing you to turn off friendly spells that are just visual clutter? Morgan Day said, yeah, we're definitely doing a pass for some of these, especially some of the new visuals that we're adding. I was doing a dungeon on beta recently, and there was a holy priest that was using what looked to be a pulsing priest halo visual that was kind of going on for a while. Yep, that is Archon. I played some Archon holy priest dungeons in beta, and my group members were like, oh, I can see your entire hero talent spell effect. I was like, oh yeah, that should be toned down. And I was like, do I need to see that? I feel like I don't need to see that. And that speaks to the work that's still ongoing, where the team often takes a pass at a lot of those visuals once things have become a bit more finalized. And we're also looking to improve our systems for this. You're essentially asking for player-defined filters, but we also feel like we can have better tools at our disposal to leverage some of those aesthetics that maybe don't need to be seen. Often we found that there are only a couple of culprits that can really lead to a lot of visual clutter and confusion in the game space, and sometimes we can strategically hide those for other people. But we're also looking to improve our own kind of tools in our tool belt there to reduce some of the visual noise that might be in an encounter, especially when you get into larger raid sizes. You're 20 to 30 people, there's just a lot going on. We actually have a lot of really great cool tools when it comes to performance and making sure your performance isn't taking too much of a hit. So potentially leveraging some of those on a more intentional design perspective, not just when performance starts to take a hit, are some of the areas we're looking to improve. I think that makes sense. I think culling some visuals in raid sizes versus in party sizes makes some sense. And I think just going through ability by ability and being like, yeah, and they've done this. They do this every beta build. It's like, yeah, your pets are smaller for other people. They're the same size for you. They look as cool for you. They're smaller for other people. Yeah, the Halo, like Halo for Archon Holy Priests, should be very faintly visible, if at all, for other people after it does its first expansion. And that's just, those are the kind of things, they do that all the time, right? Wild Spirits. You remember Wild Spirits? It used to be visual for everybody. Then they made it kind of go away for everybody right after it showed up. And that's definitely a lot better. I understand why they don't want to do players being able to go through and like edit for all 1,000 abilities in the game. Okay, this one I want to show if other people cast it. This one I don't. This one I want to. This one I don't. Because in a lot of cases, that would lead to you, the right move being to turn everything off and making the game look worse so that you could eke out a 1% benefit. And I can see, of course, why they don't want to. They don't want us to. You don't want to make the best way to play the game be a less fun way to play the game, which is what it would be there for. Even the people that would advocate for that, I think, would end up having less fun in that world. The game would feel worse. The expansion has a lot of large bosses, and players use dust to turn the boss translucent in order to see mechanics under the wings or behind the boss. This was disabled later in the expansion. Why was this done? Morgan Day says, that's a very specific example. Yeah, this was Razageth. Razageth, you could get this Dranic dust that our Holy Paladin got this dust, and he was not happy because you had to press this every 5 minutes. So on Razageth, a 13-year encounter, you had to cast a bunch of dust over the course of the fight to keep her translucent. Dust is something that would affect other players, not just yourself. And we really want to make sure that you're not impacting other people's experience. So we want to give players the tools for them to kind of create the best gameplay experience for themselves without negatively impacting others. We've added some pretty cool new options in the War Within. There will be an option to add a highlight if your character's behind some collision in game. So if your character's obscured behind a wall, there will be an option to add a highlight to your character on that, as some new UI options to affect when your camera will change positions. So sometimes maybe you're fighting that tree boss, you can have a little bit more control over your camera and how that affects or is reacting to some of the gameplay spaces. That's going to be huge. Imagine if you're walking past a tree and instead of your camera being like, woo, and then following you and then getting back behind the tree, it just stayed the same distance, but your character had an outline that you could see as you walked through the tree. That'd be way better. That'll be fun to get those tools into the player's hands, and those are things you can change for yourself rather than the solution like Dust that is affecting for everyone. I do think as well that if you have an encounter like Mythic Razageth, where there are swirlies that are going to be hard for people to see under the boss, that is a problem that should have a solution as well. It's hard. Like, that's a hard thing to solve inherently, but I think it is something worth trying to solve. Like, I think if you don't want to let us be able to dust Razageth, you should come up with another way to make it so that we don't feel like I just actually can't stand in these spots whenever the boss is randomly playing this animation. Especially because, like, sometimes it's not even like, it's just like, oh, did the boss choose auto attack animation number 3 or auto attack animation number 4? And that changes like how hard the mechanic is. That seems like a stupid thing to be a variable in changing how hard a fight is to play for, the DPS warriors on the backside of the boss. So that is my take there. Maybe even something, they have inky black potions, stinky bright potions, maybe like bossy translucenty potions could exist. I don't know if I feel like those sorts of things, like, it's tough because, again, that's a thing where it's probably technically correct to use that on every boss fight. But any boss fight where people really, 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 really wanted one of those to be available, like Razageth would have been, would be a good case where it's like, okay, we got to change how this works, how this looks. Collections. With many unobtainable collectibles coming back, could we ever see old elite transmogs have some way of acquiring them again, even if it's a low drop chance or having to hit elite in a season? Ian says, I've learned never to say never about things. Yeah, this is very true, because over the past 5 years in particular, over the past 3 years especially, a lot of nevers have gotten broken by old Liz. I think we have no plans right now to change that. We've over the years made a lot of no longer available things available again. Even some stuff that people never figured would come back, like the legendary cloak appearances from Mists that you could get today by playing Remix. But yeah, I think where we've drawn the line generally has been very niche prestige rewards that required extreme skill to get at a moment in time. So the challenge mode weapons and armor kind of in that same general bucket. That's not to say that'll never change, but I think our thinking there remains where it has been in the recent past. It's tough because for me, of people who own challenge mode weapons, some of them got it through not necessarily extreme skill, but good skill playing with a group. A lot of people bought those. It was not particularly hard to carry challenge modes, and that was a very common way of getting those, particularly late in those expansions. So in a lot of cases, it was more a case of was I playing actively during WOD and MOP rather than did I display some extreme skill? In a lot of cases, some of the most extreme skill that can be expressed in WoW is killing mythic end bosses during the expansion when they're current, during the season when they're current, dropping those mounts from those bosses. But those become evergreen, right? You can get Mythic Gul'dan mount. Mythic Gul'dan mount was something that, when I earned earning that mount required me to be so much better at WoW than I had been 9 months before I, killed Gul'dan. Before I kind of started playing the game. I started playing the game sort of seriously in Legion. I played a little bit during TBC and Wrath, pseudo seriously. I did some raiding and stuff back then, but obviously it was a very different time. It didn't play much between then and Legion. And then the day Legion came out, I was like, I'm gonna play some WoW. And over the course of Emerald Nightmare, I went from not having a guild to being in a heroic progression guild to being in a cutting edge guild. And by the time I got to Gul'dan, I was in actually that same guild. I left that guild for my current guild during farm, but during progression, I was at that guild, and killing that boss, getting it to drop those mats. I don't know if I even got one at that time or got it later during farm, but that was for me at the time, like the amount of skill that I had built over the past 6 months to be able to get that was a really huge thing for me compared to, I think that like that it's maybe comparable to the glad mounts and stuff, the elite appearances, which those stay locked away. The mythic mounts become sort of farmable further down the line. I'm happy for people to be able to get those mythic mounts that required, extreme skill for me to get at some point in time. For me, the prestige is like, first of all, it's the kill, right? Like I remember those kills of all those bosses. And second of all, like it's right after you kill it for the first time and then you hearth back to your city and you walk around on your mythic mount before anybody else has it, right? And you're like the only person in the city to be on the mythic mount. Like that feels good. I don't care about other people getting to have it whenever they can kill the boss, be that during the same patch or later on, expansions later, farming it. I don't care about that. And it does feel bad to me that there's plenty of really, really, really cool parts of WoW's, aesthetic history in old gladiator mounts, old elite appearances, old challenge mode armor sets, old mage tower armor sets. I have a lot of those things, right? Like I did all the mage towers during Legion. I have all those appearances, and I would not have any problem with people being able to earn them now, even if it doesn't require the same level of extreme skill that the mage tower used to require, which it didn't require that much skill by the end of. I did one mage tower a week as it came back up. So every time the mage tower came up, I tried to do a new challenge, and those first few were really hard. Especially I did the Resto Druid one as my second one. That was really hard. I was not good at Resto Druid. That took me a lot of prog to get. But by the end of that expansion, once you were in Taurus, like, I don't know, you could smash your face against the keyboard and do a lot of those mage towers, especially like Agatha or whatever. But anyways, I'm rambling a little bit. But my basic point here is that I have a lot, but not all of old elite stuff. And when I say elite here, I don't mean actual elite transmogs, although I do have a few of those. Not a lot of them. I didn't PvP much, but I've gotten 2400 before. I've made it into that range before. Not very many times, but I think the only time I got to 2400 was when I needed to for 233 weapons in Shadowlands Season 1. But other than that, I've not gotten that high. I've gotten 2100 a few times. Which I think was where most of the transmog stops. My basic point is that all of the old exclusive stuff I have, I would be happy if it came back in various ways for people to get. And I don't think that I think that it is a shame whenever new players are coming to this game and they see something cool and it's like, how do I get that? And the answer is, you played 10 years ago. And I think that's like, to some extent, like MMOs are full of that, but like, I think a much better answer is like, oh yeah, this was the Gul'dan mount. God, you're a new player. Let me tell you what Gul'dan was like. And then let's go back and, run through the Nighthold and we can kill Gul'dan for you. And maybe the mount will drop. And if it doesn't, we can do it again next week, right? And the new player's like, oh, this is so cool. This game has got such a rich backstory. Whereas if you instead tell them like, oh yeah, that mount was the Gul'dan mount. Like if they had the same philosophy on the Gul'dan mount as they had for this stuff, you tell that new player like, sucks to suck, man. That you didn't play 8 years ago. You don't get this mount, which first of all, Gul'dan being 8 years ago is that's not a good feeling. But yeah, that's anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. let me know what you think of all this. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.